Last week, I mentioned Robertson McQuilkin, who was the leader, the high-profile Christian leader, who stepped down from the presidency of his university and seminary and all these boards he was on, these very important things, and in chapel at his university announced that he was stepping down as the president because of the situation with his wife. I mentioned that last week. Well, Norrie Muhlhoff found a recording of this, and I want to go here. Thank you. Found a recording of Robertson McQuilkin announcing his resignation, and I want you to listen to it.
I haven't in my life experienced easy decision-making on major decisions, but one of the simplest and clearest decisions I've had to make is this one, because circumstances dictated it. Muriel, now, in the last couple of months, seems to be almost happy when with me, and almost never happy when not with me. In fact, she seems to feel trapped, becomes very fearful, sometimes almost terror, and when she can't get to me, there can be anger. She's in distress. But when I'm with her, she's happy and contented. And so I must be with her at all times. And you see, it's not only that I promised in sickness and in health, till death do us part, and I'm a man of my word. But as I have said, I don't know with this group, but I've said publicly, it's the only fair thing. She sacrificed for me for 40 years to make my life possible. So, if I cared for her for 40 years, I'd still be in debt. However, there's much more. It's not that I have to, it's that I get to. I love her very dearly, and you can tell it's not easy to talk about. She's a delight. It's a great honor to care for such a wonderful person.
Really captures what this is all about. I said last week that Christian marriage should be something qualitatively different than the marriage of non-Christians, in that it is drawing from a power that enables us to live and love in a way that is inexplicable apart from the power of the Spirit and the work of the gospel in our lives. And I'm grieved over the way marriage is portrayed in our society, even among Christians. It's this problem. It's this, it's so hard. And I'm not minimizing the difficulty, but we can have such a negativity and a pessimism toward it. And bachelor and bachelorette parties where guys wear fake ball and chains around their ankle and go on binges as if life's going to end in a really enjoyable way. And when that's the air you breathe in a culture, it takes something God has created for His glory and for the most abundant living we can have, and to display His character in the gospel to the world, and it makes it into this terrible burden you should really avoid at all costs with opt-out clauses at every level, prenuptial agreements, and all of these qualifications on this thing. And so then, even in the church, it becomes nothing but a debate about gender roles and who gets to do what, and we can easily, not that, again, that those things aren't important, but we can easily miss, in the midst of those conversations, the glorious grandeur of marriage, that it is a wonderful gift from God to display His character through our lives and in our relationships, so that He's pleased and the world sees who He is and what the gospel looks like and what it does in us. And so I want us to have a wildly rebellious, countercultural perspective on this that makes people think we're a little crazy and not in touch with reality. I think Christians should view it, non-Christians should view us that way more than they do, because we have a power that they know nothing of. And so let's live according to that power. The gospel is to display, as Dr. Muhlhoff said, the mystery out of Ephesians 5 of Christ and His church. And it leads us to be able to love in that sort of way. It doesn't mean by God's common grace we don't see wonderful marriage outside the church, among non-Christians, and wonderful self-sacrificial love according to God's common grace. But there should be something, both in the love believers have for one another in general, and that Christians have in marriage, that is qualitatively different because it's Spirit-enabled. It's gospel-enabled. And therefore, a display of who God is and what He's done in the gospel. I want to stay in Ephesians and think a little bit about what this can look like. So it can look like staying true to a marriage and saying no to all kinds of earthly accomplishments, all that were good. So McQuilkin was doing a wonderful ministry and service to the church, and he was showing the world the character of God and the display of the gospel as a leader in the church, a leader of a Christian university, a leader of ministries, and he was a missionary before this, and he loved God. And one of the things McQuilkin, as just an aside, said as he would hire faculty, he would say, Columbia in South Carolina was here where he was the president, and he said, I only want to hire faculty who are at least a little bit disappointed God doesn't have them on the mission field. That it takes work for them to be okay with not being on the front lines. That they have a sense of the Great Commission to the point where they need to work at being okay with being more behind the scenes. And I'm saying that as someone who is behind the scenes and has learned and had to work at saying, okay, it's okay if I'm not one of the Marines storming the beaches, if I'm equipping those Marines to do that. So I love that about McQuilkin. But that sort of mentality is what is fostered in his life. So when it comes to this really difficult situation, he's able to meet it. And it wasn't a stretch for him. That's the beauty of this. It's not like, well, I'm going to do the hard thing here. You could tell it was a joy for him. It wasn't just a duty, and I'm stuck with this because I made a commitment, and I am a man of my word. No, he said it was a joy and a privilege, and he realized how blessed he was by his wife, and so with gratitude and joy and enthusiasm, he's able to serve her in this way. And so I love that model. I now want to think about, though, well, what does it mean then? What does it mean to live lives in marriage as a couple to the glory of God and for the advance of the gospel? Well, I think it's got to be directly related to the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, Jesus says, in other words, I'm transferring that authority to you now. Therefore, go. You're my ambassadors. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded. The Great Commission needs to be the context of our marriage. Making disciples needs to be the context of our marriages. We need to think about not just what marriage does for us, and our sanctification, as wonderful as that is, but to get about the business of the Great Commission as married couples has got to be something we have to have front and center. We've talked about defining human flourishing in a way that's distinctively Christian. Not just being fruitful in abilities, but doing it in a way that's distinctively Christian and God-glorifying and Christ-exalting. And so that means, okay, there needs, again, to be something qualitatively different about our goals. It's not just about self-actualization and growing and becoming who God made me to be. Yes, and I don't want to miss that, but I want to do that with a gospel clarity, with a Great Commission clarity to it as well. And this, I think, is where the Christian marriage becomes especially thrilling and adventuresome. That we're not just about getting along, we're on mission together. We are not just face to face, we are shoulder to shoulder, making a difference for the name of Christ in the world. That's when marriage starts to become thrilling. You mean, not just in the way we relate, although that's the fundamental thing, but you mean together we can multiply our efforts for the sake of the advance of the gospel because we're married. And I would challenge you, if you're engaged, when you get engaged, when you're thinking about engagement, to say, am I confident that marrying this person will clearly contribute to my service to Christ and the gospel? That we will be a more formidable force for the sake of the gospel married than we would have been if we stayed single. You really need to think that way. It's not just about, do I like him, are we compatible? It's, will we serve Christ more effectively because we're married? I walk into our engaged couples class at our church, the first session. Don and I have done that frequently. And I walk in and I say, you should all break off your engagements. Unless you are absolutely sure at this point that you will serve the sake of the gospel better married than you would have single. And don't think that'll kick in when you get married. If you're not seeing that effect now, you should be very concerned. That means, yes, you're both being drawn closer to Christ because of that relationship. That's the fundamental thing, becoming more like Him, showing the fruit of the Spirit more. But also, yet you're actually seeing more effective ministry taking place because you're hanging out together a lot and focusing on this relationship. It's not making you insular and overly focused on one another at the expense of having an outward focus in ministry. No, you are more effective for the sake of the gospel. And so what I want to say is, marriage is for making children. And I don't want to neglect that it's physical children. It's procreation. Be fruitful and multiply is what God commands the first humans. And front and center is, that means, every time I teach on this in my class, I said, what does it mean to be fruitful and multiply? And my mature college students are like, make babies. And they're sort of immature. And I said, yeah, make babies. Right. So yes, to bear children. And let's not miss this. Let's not fear being Catholic too much. That we don't say, no, one of the reasons God made marriage is to have children. And that's a glorious and wonderful and astounding, miraculous thing. And disconnecting sexual intercourse from bearing children is a great tragedy. Doesn't mean that's all it's about. That's an equal problem, an error. But it is fundamentally, it needs to be something sex does we think about in light of bearing children, that this is a procreation ability. It's an astounding thing to be like God, as a creator coming alongside God and human beings coming to existence. Most amazing, astounding thing. So being fruitful and multiplying is in a very clear way about that, but it's not limited to that. I would actually say it's making good films. I would say being fruitful and multiplying, rule over and subduing, fulfilling the creation mandate is taking any ability God gives you and using it for good and for His glory. So I don't want to limit it to just bearing children generally, but I do want to focus it on bearing children. Not even biologically primarily, or even adoption primarily, but bearing spiritual children for the sake of the gospel. Let's look at Ephesians 6. So Paul continues this discussion. As has been noted before, you got to often ignore chapter and verse divisions. They are sometimes terribly done. Added much later. So here we have, look at how he continues this, 6:1. He's continuing this idea of walking in love and displaying the gospel. And watch what he says. Children, obey your parents. See, it doesn't stop with husbands and wives. This display of the gospel, this display of who God is and what He's done in us, carries out in other relationships too. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment, with a promise that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, now this is interesting. He says this is a parental responsibility, but as Dr. Muehlhoff was saying, now the fathers, I think, are having their responsibility ratcheted up here. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So, marriage is for having children. Marriage is not just for having children, it's having children in the Lord. To think that marriage is capable of bringing about children who are disciples of Jesus, that you can fulfill the great commandment in the context of marriage. With children, you've got their entire first at least 18 years to have intensive discipleship influence. It's just amazing. It's a wonderful privilege that you are able to make disciples in your own home with your own children. And so there's this in the Lord bringing up children. So So what an incredible privilege. This is one of the reasons I want us to be more enthusiastic about marriage. And this is coming from a couple who were not able to bear children. We learned out of that to continue to be incredibly enthusiastic about people bearing children in spite of the sad reality that we weren't able to. It's really hard for us for a while. So we need to celebrate marriage in part because it brings about having children and being able then to disciple them in the Lord. But I don't want to overstate that part of it because bearing children is not limited to biological children. It could include foster care and adoption as it has for us. And now we have children in our home with that sort of intensive long-term discipleship. But I wouldn't want to limit it to that either. Let me read a verse that has bummed me out over the years. Would you go to 3 John, this great little... I preached a sermon on 3 John at our church one time, and it had 16 points. It was a 16-point sermon. They were fast points. It was only a 35-minute sermon, but 3 John is an amazing book. I love the book of 3 John, and I can't talk and find it at the same time, so I'll stop talking. Anyway, look at 3 John. He's writing to his church, and look what he says in 3 John 1:4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Now, who are the children to whom he is referring? Do we know? Who is it? Like a British school child, please. Like you have a uniform on. Not me. What did you say? Yeah, it's the church to whom he's writing. Right? He's not talking about children in his home. One of the real things that's bummed me out in my life, and I still have yet, I think, to hear this verse referred to in public in its primary immediate context. It's almost always referring to children in the home, not spiritual children birthed through gospel ministry. I think it's entirely wonderful and appropriate to apply it to children in your home. I'm not saying it doesn't apply there, but the primary meaning is not that, is it? The primary meaning is spiritual children birthed through the gospel ministry your life is represented. And so bearing children now in the context of marriage then isn't limited to biological children or children in your home only, but a marriage that is a gospel procreative reality. So I want us to think about, yes, the wonder of marriage producing children and intense discipleship that allows for. But let's not limit it to that. This kind of childbearing, as we talked about when we talked about singleness, is not limited to marriage. Single people can be incredibly fruitful, like Barry helped us understand when he talked to us, that the Old Testament even talks about the day when the eunuch and the barren woman will bear more children than the woman who bears children. What? Yeah, can you imagine how that sounded to a Jew who's just waiting for the seed of the woman, to come as the Messiah, saying, no, there's coming a day, once that seed of the woman comes, that's going to bring about this ability to bear children spiritually through the Messiah's ministry that makes just biological, physical bearing of children seem like nothing. You'll have hundreds of children. That's what Jesus says. Jesus says, whoever's willing to give up mother and father and children for the sake of my gospel will gain mother, father, children 100-fold. The focus for Christians is on discipleship that enables us to have hundreds, maybe even thousands of children. That we have a spiritual fathering or mothering ministry to. That some actually, through our ministry, do come to saving new life in Christ. But then others are brought along this journey in our discipleship. So, the verse that defines me in the Bible that I think about more than any other is Galatians 2:20. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. This life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. But my ministry verse, the verse I think about most when I think about ministry is this one, Colossians 1:26 and following. Him we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom, that we may present everyone mature in Christ. For this I toil, struggling with all his energy, that he powerfully works within me. That verse can become the verse of your marriage. So can Galatians 2:20. You understand who you are in Christ more out of your marriage, but also you help others grow in maturity in Christ out of your marriage. So I plead with you to make your marriage an adventure by making it a gospel thing, making it a Great Commission thing, realizing that, whoa, we can have a ministry that's exponentially more influential and powerful for the advance of the gospel than we could have if we stayed single. We can create a home where man and woman, husband and wife, father, mother can create an environment that is incredibly nurturing and powerful and meaningful and displays the gospel in vivid ways that are astounding.